Hello everyone, my name is Ravishan. Welcome to What Makes This Scene Great. If the plot is the machine that manipulates a character's destiny in a novel, the scene is its smallest self-contained component. In What Makes This Scene Great, we'll be looking at how an author limits a character's choices and guides his or her free will, the mechanics of its cause and effect. In short, how does an author make it feel so real? Today's episode, we are going to be looking at Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. The book was published in 1955 and made Nabokov both loved and hated, mostly for the wrong reasons. The scene that we are going to be looking at today is from Part 1, Chapter 10, or Section 10. So Humbert, the novel's protagonist, sees Lolita for the first time. It's set in Lolita's mother's house. Lolita's mother, Charlotte Haze, is giving Humbert, a prospective tenant, a tour of the house and eventually introduces Humbert to her daughter, Lolita. Spoiler alert. Duh. Read the book first. There are three main characters in this scene: Humbert, Lolita, and Lolita's mother, Charlotte Haze. So what are the motivations of the characters at the outset of this scene? There's Mrs. Haze. She wants to romantically ensnare a single male to cure her husbandlessness. Then there's Humbert. You should know by now that Nabokovian names are an exercise of caricature. It's a kind of Dickensian trick of summary characterization. Humbert is the chosen alias of the protagonist whose memoirs, composed in prison, we are now reading. It alliterates and makes you think of Umbra or Shadow. He has landed in some New England countryside or suburb after exchanging letters with a equally preposterously named Mr. McCoo in order to be hired as the private tutor of the daughter of the said Mr. McCoo. By this time, Humbert is frothing with anticipation, quote, imagining in every detail the enigmatic nymphette that he would coach in French and fondle in Humbertish, unquote. However, disembarking at the train station, Humbert is informed by McCoo that his house burnt down and that all plans are cancelled. In lieu of the McCooling that Humbert was sharpening his fangs for, McCoo leads Humbert to take residence with a disappointingly mature Mrs. Haze. At the time of the scene that we're discussing, Humbert's only aim is to get away both from the Haze trap and the McCoo sympathies. He's only consenting to be taken along this guided tour out of, quote, old world politeness, unquote. Then we have Lolita. Her real name is Dolores Haze. In her posh mama's dialect of cutesy abbreviations, she's Lo. In the fancy of the madman that we get to know as Humbert, she's Lolita, a composite of a old memory and unsublimated art. More of that later. We don't know much about her at this time. She's almost a negative space, a vacuum around which Humbert's reason warps. It is the vortex of tail-chasing self-justifications that Nabokov is really interested in, and into which we shall soon enter. So what does Nabokov want out of this scene? He wants, 1, to establish the love triangle between Humbert, Lolita, and Charlotte Haze. 2nd, he wants to set up the architectural layout of the house. These places, these locations are the stages on which the pivotal moments of the plot are enacted, at least in the first part. Thirdly, there's the long-term goal of getting rid of Mama Haze and bringing Humbert and Lolita together. That doesn't happen till much later in the book, certainly not in this scene. But still, Mama Haze's death has to prefigure in this scene. If not, her demise will look like a deus ex machina, done just in order to bring Humbert and Lolita together. So something about Mrs. Haze's character, something about her delusions, have to lead to her demise. So how does Nabokov achieve these things? We look at the love triangle, establishing Mrs. Haze. We are introduced to Mrs. Haze First, by a characterization of the kitschy world that she inhabits. Kitsch, or in the Nabokovian diagnosis, poshlost, is a theme and target of all of Nabokov's work, and definitely at the center of Lolita as well, as is psychoanalysis, which is the pseudoscientific counterpart of bad art. Let's take a look at this passage from page 36, where Humbert is being led to the house. The front hall was graced with door chimes, a white-eyed wooden thingamabob of commercial Mexican origin, and that banal darling of the arty middle class, Van Gogh's Arlesion. A door ajar to the right afforded a glimpse of the living room, with some more Mexican trash in a corner cabinet and a striped sofa along the wall. There was a staircase at the end of the hallway, and as I stood mopping my brow, only now did I realize how hot it had been outdoors, and to stare at something, at an old grey tennis ball that lay on the oak chest, there came from the upper landing the contralto voice of Mrs. Haze, who, leaning over the banisters, inquired melodiously, "Is that Monsieur Humbert?" You should have noticed by now that Nabokov has already accomplished laying out the architectural layout of the house. It's important because Lolita doesn't proceed from scene to scene very linearly like a modern novel. We are in a postmodern novel. So there are between scenes these interludes, asides, these little playful teasers of what things are to come, and parts of récit where Nabokov just condenses long passages of time and character development. But what scenes that do occur, in the conventional sense of a scene, as a playwright would understand, say, enter Humbert, exit Lolita kind of suspense, those scenes do take place in these locations. Well, there would be the living room where Humbert, Lolita, and Lolita's mother, the entire love triangle, could assemble together. Upstairs on the right side would be Lolita's and her mother's room, which was to later become the conjugal room of Humbert and Charlotte Haze. On the left would be Humbert's den. In between would be the staircase and the landing, where would take place many flirting enmeshings between a flighty low and a web-spinning humbug, say. Immediately next to the landing is the toilet, where Humbert would rush to struggle his arousal. Right next to the toilet is Humbert's den, where the half-ashamed, now humbled Humbert would retire and still dream of more wicked things. You should appreciate the economy with which Nabokov quickly gives out a kind of map of the house and kind of orients our imagination as to what's going to take place where. So we just don't get lost in abstraction. So let's get back to the introduction of Mrs. Haze. There came the contralto voice of Mrs. Haze, who, leaning over the banisters, inquired melodiously, "Is that Monsieur Humbert?" A bit of cigarette ash dropped from there in addition. Presently the lady herself, sandals, maroon slacks, yellow silk blouse, squarish face, in that order, came down the steps, her index finger still tapping upon her cigarette. I think I had better describe her right away, to get it over with. The poor lady was in her middle 30s. She had a shiny forehead, plucked eyebrows, and quite simple but not unattractive features of a type that may be defined as a weak solution of a Marlene Dietrich. Patting her bronze-brown bun, she led me into the parlor where we talked for a minute about the McCoo fire and the privilege of living in Ramsdale. Let's go back for a moment to the wooden thingamabob of Mexican origin and Van Gogh's Arlesion. This is not just Nabokov being snobby. If you're a Nabokov veteran, you're well aware of his contempt of Van Gogh, or more specifically the Van Gogh cult, which is basically a bunch of sentimental people who rhapsodize over Vincent's drunkenness, his poverty, his suffering, his obscurity, worshipping qualities that are not even present on the canvas, precisely because they are not present on the canvas. As to what's really there, the colors and the draftsmanship, They really can't tell the difference between a Michelangelo and a humanoid carrot. We must remember that Humbert is a artist manque, that is to say, someone with enough talent to discern talent, but not enough to create. His hatred of Mama Haze, the pretentious mediocrity who is passing herself off as this dilettante artist, is automatic, and it makes it easier for Humbert to exploit her. So here we have hate at first sight. Her smile was but a quizzical jerk of one eyebrow, and uncoiling herself from the sofa as she talked, she kept making spasmodic dashes at 3 ashtrays near the fender, where lay the brown core of an apple. How neat is that little aside where Nabokov contrasts Mrs. Haze's airs and her pretentiousness, while also showing how messy a housekeeper she was. She was obviously one of those women whose polished words may reflect a book club or bridge club or any other deadly conventionality, but never her soul. Women who are completely devoid of humor, women utterly indifferent at heart to the dozen or so possible subjects of a parlor conversation, but very particular about the rules of such conversations, through the sunny cellophane of which not very appetizing frustrations can be readily distinguished. I was perfectly aware that if by any wild chance I became her lodger, she would methodically proceed to do in regard to me what taking a lodger probably meant to her all along, and I would again be enmeshed in one of those tedious affairs I knew so well. One thing you need to keep in mind is that this kind of dismissive characterization is something that Nabokov does with restraint. He knows that if he does it too flippantly, there is the risk of killing the character by over-explanation. You should take a look at what follows immediately after this conversation. There is a little bit of dialogue. There isn't much dialogue in Nabokov. There's a little bit of dialogue where Nabokov allows Mrs. Haze to express her character in just one line. Quote, "I see you are not too favorably impressed," unquote, said the lady, letting her hand rest for a moment upon my sleeve. She combined a cool forwardness, the overflow of what I think is called poise, with a shyness and sadness that caused her detached way of selecting her words to seem so unnatural as the intonation of a professor of quote-unquote speech. "This is not a neat household, I confess," the doomed dear continued, "but I assure you," she looked at my lips, "you will be very comfortable indeed. Let me show you the garden." Nabokov has to, sneak in little snippets of dialogue and let the character breathe, or else the character will be too dead, too flat. He knows that. You wouldn't really notice the lack of dialogue or the long unbroken sections of prose because Nabokov is a master of variation. It's important for Nabokov to contrast Charlotte Haze's privations with her pretensions. That little dialogue just before, where Mrs. Haze's black servant talks to Mrs. Haze just before exiting the scene, is also very important. The servant says, "I'll go now, Mrs. Haze." Mrs. Haze replies, "Yes, Louise, I'll settle with you Friday." Like, so much is established in this small scene so quickly. We know that Mrs. Haze not only is pretentious, but also does not have the means to be so. Even though Humbert is cruel to Mrs. Haze, there are moments where Nabokov, the author, is sympathetic. What makes this tragedy, or any tragedy, tragic is that all three, Haze, Lolita, Humbert, could have lived happily fulfilled lives. They're doomed, but they're also full of promise. They make us pray for them at every turn, even though they keep taking the wrong turn. I mean, Haze, provided a husband, would have settled as some harmless suburban Karen, petting half a sculpture or some abortion that she hopes will grow into art, organize high tea parties for neighborhood housewives, make sure that KFC managers know who they're talking to, etc., etc. Lolita. Lolita is a vain and corrupt child. We don't know much about her. We don't certainly get to know anything at all about her in this scene. What she is, at least as regards Humbert, is implied through the tonal contrast of the narrative. For pages and pages, Humbert is faint with loathing and boredom. And then suddenly, on page 39, there came a sudden burst of greenery. The piazza, sang out my leader, and then, without at the least warning, a blue sea wave swelled under my heart, and from a mat in a pool of sun, half naked, kneeling, turning about on her knees, there was my Riviera love peering at me over dark glasses. This is Lolita, and her almost staged pose is very important too. This is a little slip of what we get to know as Lolita's character. Lolita is a byproduct of 50s Hollywood. She's eager to promote herself to adulthood and is cultivating an actressy mystique to separate herself from her contemporaries, the ugly ducklings, as Humbert would call them, the just nice or sweet or attractive. When Lolita sees Humbert, she sees, quote, a great big handsome hunk of movie-land manhood, unquote. That's as far as we get to know Lolita. Anyway, who is this Riviera love? This is, of course, Humbert's old memory, his old thwarted child love, Annabel Lee, the prototype of Lolita, who Lolita was to later completely eclipse, so Humbert says. Annabel Lee is really a segue, a genre crossover, sort of, to Edgar Allan Poe's haunting poem Annabel Lee, also titled. Poe's Annabel is fairy-like. His love is yearning made abstract. Nabokov's Annabel is all flesh and spittle. His love is a struggle in a sandy beach cave. This is one of Nabokov's tricks, making you question whether which version is sublime and which is pornography, which is the degradation and which is the elevation. So we get to Humbert. Humbert is a case of squandered talent. He is not, as he would later compare himself, a Gaston Godin, a GG. Gaston Godin is an implied character in a later subplot. He's a lefty professor surrounded by arty bits, antiques and chocolate liqueurs, loved by everyone. Only Humbert knows that this obese grotesque is a plain pedophile, a fraud without a conscience or any talent, debauching both scholarship and young neighborhood boys with impunity. These long sections where Nabokov expatiates over Humbert's not only looks but also his intellect. Those are important. These are important because this book is not Hannibal. It's not about the supervillain in a smoking jacket. It's about Humbert, a reptile, starving and naked. This most devious of predators will teach you about the unbearable pain and pleasure of waiting with open mouth, immobile, for prey to just walk in. Pay attention to the closing of this scene. I find it most difficult to express with adequate force that flash, that shiver, that impact of passionate recognition. Nabokov is of course talking about the moment he saw Lolita. In the course of the sun-shot moment that my glance slithered over the kneeling child, her eyes blinking over those stern dark spectacles, the little Herr Doctor who was to cure me of all my aches. While I passed by her in my adult disguise, a great big handsome hunk of movie-land manhood, the vacuum of my soul managed to suck in every detail of her bright beauty, and these I checked against the features of my dead bride. A little later, of course, this nouvelle, this Lolita, my Lolita, was to eclipse completely her prototype. There goes Humbert. All side glances, leers, and saving up for later enjoyment. He is a pervert. In the hands of a lesser artist, Humbert would have become a self-assured predator, and this would have become some kind of crime procedural. Objective 3 of Nabokov, killing Charlotte Haze. While he's laying out the groundwork, making Humbert hate Charlotte Haze and kind of superimposing the new Lolita over his mental image of Annabel Lee. While doing all of this, he's also activating the kind of doomsday machine which is ticking towards the ultimate demise of Charlotte Haze. You have to know that marrying the fates of Lolita and Humbert, like I said, is preposterous. The union of Humbert and Lolita is perverse and extraordinary. And this book is not surreal fantasy. Not only must the union be possible, it must also be plausible. And it has to last long enough to fester and to rot. This is how Nabokov sets the accident that's going to finish off Mama Haze. This is from page 36. Speaking of sharp turns, we almost ran over a meddlesome suburban dog, one of those who lie in wait of cars. As we swerved into Lawn Street, a little further, the Haze house, a white frame horror, appeared, looking dingy and old, more grey than white, the kind of place you know will have a rubber tuber fixable to the tub faucet in lieu of a shower. I tipped the chauffeur and hoped he would immediately drive away so I might double back unnoticed to my hotel and bag. But the man merely crossed over to the other side of the street where an old lady was calling to him from her porch. Every creature we meet in this scene, revolving around their monomanias and motorized by their routines, come together to create the accident that's going to finish off Charlotte Haze. One fateful day, that neurotic dog is going to lunge out of alignment and a reckless driver is going to smear the road with Charlotte Haze's brains. Once you read the book and you reread this section, Mama Haze's death may feel predictable. It's not so much the dog and the car, and it's also Mama Haze's, Charlotte Haze's cognitive dissonance. By this time, Charlotte Haze has discovered Humbert's true nature and the true intentions with which he marries her. The accident is waiting to happen. The stage is set, but what really puts Charlotte Haze onto the trajectory of disaster is the cognitive dissonance with which she sleepwalks across the road. Her mental state is later revealed when Humbert reads fragments of those 3 letters that she is going to post after discovering Humbert's true nature. One of those letters contains a hate-filled missive to Lolita, who is by now at that point being a brat backstage in a faraway summer camp, which is what Lolitas in real life actually amount to. Another letter suggests an alternate ending for Lolita, so to speak, in a, quote, grey, gaunt reformatory for girls, far away from Humbert's, which is where you may presume Lolitas would end up in real life. And the third letter relapses into second thoughts. Mama Haze, even after reading Humbert's diary and being privy to all the disgusting thoughts that Humbert has entertained so far, says perhaps after a year of separation, Humbert could be cured and might be ready for a healthy, more socially acceptable form of love. Such was the delusion, the power of delusion that held Charlotte Haze. She simply cannot understand how a hybrid, moody European like Humbert could not fall so obsessively in love with the elegant suburban dilettante that Haze is. And it was the breakdown of that delusion that actually made her lose her mind, not see the car coming to wipe her off the floor. So, a word about those 3 letters. Lolita ending up in a girls' reformatory, some stern boarding school somewhere. Charlotte Haze possibly taking Lolita away from Humbert after Humbert being discovered. A third where Humbert would eventually cure himself and hide his true nature. The fact that these 3 possible endings are torn, just as the letters that contain these endings are torn by Humbert, leaves us with the more improbable but still possible ending. That's how Lolita becomes the child bride, runaway sex slave, and then finally an anonymous drudge in Canada, married to a dim laborer who is too glad to question her past. But that's another scene for another day. Almost every scene in Lolita is a piece of precise clockwork. The murder of Claire Quilty, the double-talking mystery man at Enchanted Hunters, so on and so on. I chose this scene because it would not be so obscure to those who had read Lolita at least once. Of course, Lolita would be lifeless bore if it were just a collection of neat, sterile episodes. The book teems with so many digressions, shadows and sub-characters, Jeans and Johns and Mark, which gives it life. Sometimes a writer adds a detail or subplot not because it's necessary, but because he wants to share some surplus of creativity. Almost always a writer writes not because it's necessary, but because he can. Necessity should not be any gauge for aesthetics. So thank you for watching. If you couldn't tell by the title, this video was obviously inspired by Rick Beato. He has an awesome series called What Makes This Song Great. His videos have given me newer ways to appreciate music. I hope if you belong to the dwindling, critically endangered species of readers, at least I would have given you hope in knowing that you're not alone. Okie doke, over and out. See you when I see ya.